The hook. 48 hours after the hearing, blood dripped onto the marble floor of the federal building's fifth-floor men's room. Special Agent Frank Torino, Vincent's nephew planted in the FBI 3 years ago, pressed a towel against the gash above his left eye where Hoover's enforcer had connected with brass knuckles. The bathroom door swung open. Frank froze, recognizing the polished Oxford shoes beneath the stall door. Associate Director Clyde Tolson never used the public facilities. This was a message. Agent Torino. Tolson's voice carried the same measured menace as his boss. You missed yesterday's debriefing. Frank kept pressure on the wound. Food poisoning, sir. Interesting. Because according to our surveillance, you were in Little Italy, having dinner with your uncle's lieutenant, Carlo Benedetti. Tolson's footsteps echoed closer. The same Carlo Benedetti who somehow knew exactly which questions Senator McCarthy would ask your uncle. The same questions you had advance access to. The brass knuckles had been a warning. This conversation was the real threat. Frank straightened, meeting Tolson's pale blue eyes in the mirror. I don't know what you're implying, sir. Tolson smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that never reached his eyes. I'm not implying anything, Agent Torino. I'm stating facts. Your uncle embarrassed the director in front of the entire nation, made him look weak, old, irrelevant. He paused, adjusting his tie with surgical precision. The director doesn't enjoy feeling irrelevant. Through the bathroom's small window, Frank could see the Washington Monument piercing the gray March sky. Somewhere in this building, Edgar Hoover sat in his fortress of secrets, planning moves that would crush everyone Frank had ever loved. The brass knuckles had damaged more than flesh. They'd shattered his illusion that he could play both sides indefinitely. Sir, with all due respect, my uncle was expressing his First Amendment rights. Tolson's laugh cut through the air like a blade. Your uncle forfeited his rights the moment he chose his profession, just as you forfeited yours the moment you chose your family. He stepped closer, close enough that Frank could smell his aftershave. Expensive, surgical, wrong. Did you really think we didn't know? Did you think 40 years of investigating organized crime wouldn't eventually lead us to discover Vincent Torino's nephew working in our criminal division? The blood had stopped flowing, but Frank's hands trembled as he lowered the towel. If you knew, why did you let me stay? Because, Agent Torino, you've been extraordinarily useful. Every piece of intelligence you've fed your family has been carefully curated by the director himself. Every leaked raid schedule, every compromised investigation, all part of a larger design. Tolson's reflection smiled in the mirror. Your uncle thinks he's been outsmarting the FBI for 3 years. In reality, he's been dancing to our tune. The revelation hit Frank like a second set of brass knuckles. Every family gathering where he'd shared information, every warning he'd passed along, every time he'd felt like he was protecting people he loved, he'd actually been setting them up. The hearing was supposed to be contained, Frank whispered. Uncle Vinny wasn't supposed to make it personal. No, he wasn't. Tolson's voice carried the weight of disappointed expectations. The director expected professional testimony, respectful disagreement, perhaps some legal maneuvering. He did not expect to be called a paranoid old woman on national television. Frank turned from the mirror, facing Tolson directly. So what happens now? Tolson checked his watch. A gold Omega that probably cost more than Frank's annual salary. Now, Agent Torino, you're going to continue doing exactly what you've been doing. You're going to feed information to your family. You're going to attend their meetings. You're going to be the dutiful nephew. His pale eyes glittered. The only difference is that now you know the truth. Now you understand that every piece of intelligence you share is another nail in their coffins. And if I refuse, then your mother, Vincent's sister, will receive some very interesting photographs of her son meeting with known criminals. Your badge will disappear, your pension will evaporate, and your uncle will learn that his trusted nephew has been an FBI informant for 3 years. Tolson's smile widened. Paranoid as Vincent may think the director is, he's quite thorough when it comes to insurance policies. Frank's reflection stared back from the mirror. Split lip, blackened eye, the face of a man caught between two worlds belonging to neither. Outside, Washington continued its daily business, unaware that in a fifth-floor bathroom, the destruction of America's most powerful crime family had just accelerated. "The director is waiting," Tolson said, moving toward the door. "Room 5100. He'd like to discuss your next family dinner." As the door swung shut, Frank Torino understood that his uncle's laughter in the Senate chamber hadn't just embarrassed Edgar Hoover. It had signed death warrants for everyone Vincent cared about, including the nephew who'd been betraying him since 1964. Room 5100 sat at the end of a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, lined with portraits of former directors whose eyes followed Frank's unsteady progress. Each step echoed against marble floors polished to mirror brightness, reflecting his damaged face back at him like accusations. The brass nameplate beside the heavy oak door read simply "Director." No need for elaboration when you were the most feared man in Washington. Frank paused outside, pressing his palm against the cool wood. Through the door came the soft whisper of pages turning, the deliberate scratch of a fountain pen. Hoover was reading, always absorbing, always cataloging the weaknesses of men who thought themselves untouchable. The door opened before Frank could knock. "Punctuality, Agent Torino," came the voice from behind an enormous mahogany desk. "One of the few virtues your uncle never taught you to abandon." Edgar Hoover didn't look up from the file spread before him. Thick manila folders arranged with geometric precision, each tab labeled in his distinctive handwriting. At 72, the director remained imposing despite his diminutive stature, his presence filling the cavernous office like smoke fills a closed room. The late afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs and leather-bound volumes that contained the secrets of 3 decades. Frank stepped inside, the door closing with a whisper behind him. The office smelled of old leather, furniture polish, and something else, the metallic scent of fear that seemed permanently embedded in the air itself. Oil paintings of Washington and Lincoln gazed down from mahogany-paneled walls, their faces stern with the weight of history. "Sir, Associate Director Tolson said you wanted to sit." The word carried the force of law. Frank lowered himself into the chair facing Hoover's desk, its leather creaking like old bones. From this angle he could see the director's pale hands moving across the file pages, soft manicured hands that had never thrown a punch but had destroyed more lives than any assassin's bullets. "Do you know what this is, Agent Torino?" Hoover finally looked up, his dark eyes magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles. The file between them bore a tab reading "Vincent Torino, Operational Profile." "No, sir." Hoover's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. "This is your uncle's life. Every meal he's eaten in public since 1945, every woman he's bedded, every confession he's heard from dying soldiers in his organization, every moment of weakness, every flash of sentiment, every carefully hidden fear." He closed the file with deliberate precision, including his obsession with protecting his sister's son. The words hit Frank like ice water. His mother, gentle Maria Torino, who still lit candles for his father's soul every Sunday at Sacred Heart, who worried when he missed dinner, who believed her boy worked for the government catching bank robbers and car thieves. She had no idea that her brother Vincent ran the most powerful crime family on the eastern seaboard, and even less idea that her son had been caught between 2 masters for 3 years. "My mother isn't involved in any of this," Frank said, his voice hoarser than intended. "She's never even met Uncle Vinny outside of Christmas dinner." "Your mother," Hoover said, opening another file, "works as a secretary at St. Mary's Catholic School in Alexandria. She volunteers at the soup kitchen every Tuesday evening. She takes the 7:15 bus home, stops at Mosconi's Market for groceries, and arrives at her apartment on Elm Street by 6:30. The director's eyes never left Frank's face. She waters her begonias every morning at precisely 7 a.m., wearing the blue house dress you bought her last Christmas." The casual intimacy of the surveillance details made Frank's stomach lurch. They'd been watching his mother, sweet, innocent Maria who wouldn't harm a spider, cataloging her movements like she was a dangerous criminal instead of a 60-year-old woman whose greatest sin was occasionally taking communion wine at Saturday evening service. "She doesn't know," Frank whispered. "No, she doesn't. She believes her son is a good Catholic boy who works for J. Edgar Hoover himself, keeping America safe from communists and criminals." Hoover removed his glasses, cleaning them with a white handkerchief. Without them, his eyes seemed smaller, more reptilian. What do you think would happen to that belief if certain photographs surfaced? If her parish priest received documentation of her son's extracurricular activities? Frank's hands clenched in his lap. Through the office windows, he could see the lights beginning to flicker on across Washington. Government workers heading home to suburban houses. Families gathering for dinner, normal people living normal lives untouched by the web of surveillance and blackmail that stretched from this room into every corner of American society. "She'd never forgive me," he said. "No," Hoover agreed, replacing his glasses. "She wouldn't. Loss of faith. Agent Torino. It's the cruelest weapon in our arsenal, much more effective than bullets." The director stood, moving to the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. Even in silhouette, he radiated the quiet menace that had made presidents nervous for 4 decades. "Your uncle laughed at me," Hoover said softly. In front of the entire nation, Vincent Torino suggested that I was a relic, irrelevant, past my prime. Frank said nothing. Outside, darkness was falling. "He's about to learn," Hoover continued, "what happens to men who mistake age for weakness." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue. Frank studied Hoover's silhouette against the gathering dusk, watching the director's reflection merge with the window's dark glass. The old man seemed to be waiting for something, a response, an objection, perhaps even an act of defiance that would justify whatever terrible machinery he'd already set in motion. The phone rang. Not the red telephone that connected directly to the White House, nor the secure line that scrambled communications with field offices across the nation. This was Hoover's private number, a line so exclusive that fewer than a dozen people in Washington possessed it. The director's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly before he turned back to his desk. "Yes." His voice carried its usual authority, but Frank detected something else beneath the surface: uncertainty. Perhaps even concern. Frank couldn't hear the caller's words, only the tinny whisper of a distant voice speaking rapidly, urgently. Hoover's face remained impassive as he listened, but his free hand moved to the Vincent Torino file, fingers drumming against the manila cover in an unconscious rhythm that betrayed his composure. "When?" Hoover asked finally. More whispered words. The director's jaw tightened. "Are you certain it's authentic?" The response was longer this time. Hoover's eyes found Frank's face, studying him with an intensity that made every nerve ending fire warning signals. Whatever the caller was saying, it concerned the Torino family. It concerned Frank himself. "Very well. Bring it to me immediately, and ensure no one else has seen it." Hoover replaced the receiver with characteristic precision, but his movements seemed fractionally slower than usual, age showing through the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. "Agent Torino," he said, settling back into his chair, "how well do you know your family's history?" The question felt like stepping onto ice that might shatter at any moment. "Sir?" "Your uncle's rise to power, the early days, the 1920s, when Vincent was still learning the difference between ambition and survival." Hoover opened a different file, this one older, its edges yellowed with age. "What has he told you about those years?" Frank's mind raced through fragments of overheard conversations, stories shared during rare moments when Uncle Vinny's guard was down. Not much. He worked for the Castellanos back then. Small-time stuff, bootlegging mostly. Small-time. Hoover's laugh held no warmth. "Your uncle has always understood the value of modest narratives, much safer than the truth." Through the office windows, Frank could see a black sedan pulling up to the federal building's main entrance. Even from 5 floors up, he recognized the purposeful movement of bureau agents, men arriving with something that couldn't wait for morning briefings or scheduled appointments. "The truth being?" Frank asked. Hoover didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a photograph from the aged file, studying it in the lamplight. Frank couldn't see the image from his position, but he watched the director's face transform, the mask of professional indifference slipping to reveal something raw and unguarded. Pain, recognition, a grief so old it had fossilized into permanent scar tissue. "The truth," Hoover said quietly, is that some secrets are buried so deeply that we convince ourselves they never existed, until someone decides to excavate them. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, the measured pace of agents carrying something precious and dangerous. Frank's pulse accelerated as the sounds grew closer, accompanied by the hushed voices of men who understood that certain information could reshape the world simply by existing. A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Enter." Associate Director Tolson appeared in the doorway, followed by two agents Frank didn't recognize. Tolson carried a manila envelope sealed with red wax, the kind of package that typically contained state secrets or evidence of treason. His pale face seemed even more bloodless than usual. "Director," Tolson said, "the package arrived through intermediaries. Chain of custody has been compromised, but our analysts believe it's genuine." Hoover extended his hand without a word. As Tolson placed the envelope on the desk, Frank noticed that the older man's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly, a detail so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But Frank had spent 3 years learning to read the micro-expressions of dangerous men, and Edgar Hoover was afraid. The wax seal broke with a sound like bone snapping. Inside was a single letter, handwritten on cream-colored stationery that had aged to the color of old ivory. Hoover unfolded it carefully, as if it might disintegrate at his touch. His eyes moved across the page with excruciating slowness, and Frank watched 4 decades of absolute certainty crumble in the space of a heartbeat. The director's face went ashen. The letter fluttered from his nerveless fingers, settling on the desktop like a butterfly with poisoned wings. "Get out." The words barely qualified as a whisper. "All of you, get out." But Frank had already glimpsed the signature at the bottom of the page, a woman's name written in fading ink, followed by a date that made his blood turn to ice, September 15th, 1925, and below that, in the same delicate handwriting, about our son. The office fell silent, except for the whisper of forced air through hidden vents and the distant hum of Washington traffic 5 floors below. Frank remained frozen in his chair, the words about our son echoing in his mind like gunshots in an empty cathedral. Tolson and the other agents had vanished as quickly as shadows at sunrise, leaving only Frank and the director alone with whatever revelation had just torn through 40 years of carefully constructed reality. Hoover sat motionless behind his desk, staring at the letter as if it were a coiled serpent. His hands, those soft manicured instruments of destruction, lay flat against the mahogany surface, fingers spread wide as though he were trying to anchor himself to something solid. The aged paper seemed to glow in the lamplight cream-colored accusations written in a woman's fading ink. "Sir," Frank began carefully, "should I—" "No." The word cut through air thick with unspoken implications. Hoover's eyes never left the letter. "You should not speak. You should not move. You should not even breathe loudly while I decide whether you're going to walk out of this room or disappear entirely." Frank's throat constricted. In 3 years of working for the Bureau, he'd heard whispers about agents who'd simply vanished, men who'd seen too much or asked too many questions, their personnel files mysteriously transferred to remote field offices in Alaska or wiped from existence altogether. The FBI's basement supposedly contained rooms that weren't on any official blueprint, soundproofed spaces where inconvenient truths were buried along with the people who discovered them. The director finally reached for the letter, his movements deliberate and careful as a surgeon approaching an unexploded bomb. He read it again, and Frank watched the color drain further from his face until Hoover resembled a waxwork figure of himself, perfectly preserved but somehow fundamentally lifeless. "September 15th, 1925, Hoover murmured, his voice barely audible. 42 years ago. I was 28 years old, assistant director of the Bureau, certain that I understood how the world worked." Frank risked a shallow breath. Through the office windows he could see lights flickering on across the Federal Triangle, clerks and secretaries and mid-level bureaucrats settling in for another evening of processing America's secrets. None of them knew that in room 5100, their director was confronting a ghost that threatened to unravel everything he'd built. "There was a woman," Hoover continued, speaking more to himself than to Frank. "Catherine Moreau, French-Canadian, beautiful in the way that makes young men forget they have careers to protect. His fingers traced the letter's edge without touching it. She worked for a bootlegger named Castellano. We thought she might become an informant. I thought I could handle the recruitment personally. The name Castellano sent ice through Frank's veins. Uncle Vinny had worked for the Castellanos in the 1920s, had risen through their ranks during Prohibition, had eventually absorbed their territory when old man Castellano died in a car accident that everyone knew wasn't accidental. Hoover stood abruptly, moving to the window with mechanical precision. His reflection stared back from the darkening glass, a 72-year-old man confronting the consequences of choices made when the century was younger and he'd believed himself invincible. "I was careful," he said. "Extraordinarily careful. False names, secret meetings, hotel rooms paid for with cash. She never knew my real identity. I made certain of it." But even as he spoke the words, Frank could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. The director who'd spent 4 decades collecting secrets had just discovered that someone had been collecting his. The telephone rang again. This time, Hoover ignored it. The sound echoed through the office like a death knell, urgent, insistent, demanding attention that would not be given. On the 4th ring, it fell silent, but Frank knew it would ring again. News like this didn't wait for convenient moments. "She disappeared," Hoover continued. "October 1925. Vanished without warning or explanation. I convinced myself she'd been discovered. Executed by Castellano's people for consorting with federal agents. I never suspected—" His voice trailed off into silence heavy with 40 years of willful ignorance. Frank understood now why his hands were shaking. The letter wasn't just about Edgar Hoover's past. It was about the Torino family's future. If Vincent was the son mentioned in that fading ink, if Uncle Vinny was the child Hoover never knew existed, then everything Frank thought he understood about his family's rise to power had been built on lies. More importantly, if Vincent knew the truth, if he'd known all along, then his public humiliation of Hoover hadn't been about Senate hearings or organized crime investigations. It had been personal, a son confronting the father who'd abandoned him before birth. The implications crashed over Frank like cold water. Every family dinner, every shared confidence, every moment of trust between uncle and nephew, all of it contaminated by secrets that reached back to an age when bootleggers ruled Chicago and young FBI agents thought they could love dangerous women without consequences. Hoover turned from the window, his face carved from stone and shadow. "Agent Torino," he said quietly, "I believe we need to discuss your family tree." Frank's mouth went dry. The implications of Hoover's words crashed through his mind like dominoes falling in an endless chain reaction. If Uncle Vinny was Hoover's son, if the most powerful crime boss on the Eastern Seaboard shared blood with the man who dedicated his life to destroying organized crime, then every conversation, every family gathering, every moment of Frank's double life had been orchestrated by forces he'd never seen coming. "You don't know for certain," Frank managed, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "A letter from 40 years ago. It could be anyone's son." Hoover's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Could be? Agent Torino, when did your uncle first contact you about working for his organization?" The question landed like a physical blow. Frank's mind raced backward through 3 years of careful manipulation, remembering how Uncle Vinny had approached him just months after he'd graduated from Quantico. The timing had seemed fortuitous then. A family connection offering easy money, a way to supplement his bureau salary while playing both sides against each other. "January 1965, Frank whispered. 3 months after I opened a formal investigation into his operations. 3 months after his name first appeared on my desk as a priority target." Hoover moved closer, his footsteps silent on the Persian carpet. "Your uncle doesn't make mistakes, Agent Torino. He doesn't trust family connections or sentimental bonds. He trusts leverage, control, information." The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were contracting around them. Frank could smell the director's cologne, something expensive and old-fashioned that belonged to another era, when men like Hoover had believed they could shape the world through secrets and fear. "He's been using me," Frank said. The words tasted like ashes. "We've both been using you." Hoover's honesty was more brutal than any lie. "The question is, what happens now that the game board has changed?" Before Frank could respond, the office door burst open without ceremony. Associate Director Tolson stumbled inside, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his pale face flushed with something approaching panic. "Director, we have a problem. Multiple problems." Tolson's eyes darted between Hoover and Frank, clearly uncertain how much he should say in front of a compromised agent. "Vincent Torino is missing." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Hoover's expression didn't change, but Frank saw his hands tighten into fists at his sides. "Define missing," Hoover said. "He left his estate in New Jersey 2 hours ago, alone. No bodyguards, no driver, no security detail. Our surveillance teams lost him somewhere in the Lincoln Tunnel." Tolson's voice carried the professional calm of a man reporting disaster. "His organization is in chaos. Half his lieutenants think he's been kidnapped. The other half think he's planning something." Frank felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Uncle Vinny never went anywhere without protection, never made unscheduled trips, never acted without careful planning and multiple contingencies. The man who'd built an empire on calculated risk didn't simply disappear into the New York night, unless he'd finally learned something that changed everything. "There's more," Tolson continued. "We intercepted communications from Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. Word is spreading through the families that Torino received some kind of message today. Something that sent him running." Hoover's gaze moved to the letter still lying open on his desk. The cream-colored paper seemed to pulse in the lamplight like a living thing, its faded ink carrying secrets that had festered in darkness for 4 decades. "What kind of message?" Frank asked, though he already suspected the answer. Tolson's eyes found his. Same type of envelope, same red wax seal, hand-delivered through intermediaries. He paused, swallowing hard. "Director, someone is systematically revealing information that was supposed to stay buried forever." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Frank watched Hoover's face transform as the implications crystallized. Someone with access to decades-old intelligence was using it as a weapon. Someone who understood exactly which secrets would cause the most damage when exposed. "Catherine Moreau," Hoover said quietly. "She's still alive." The words fell into silence so complete that Frank could hear his own heartbeat. A woman who'd been presumed dead for 40 years was reaching out from whatever shadows had hidden her, using her son as a weapon against the man who'd unknowingly abandoned them both. "She knows," Frank whispered. "She knows everything." Hoover nodded slowly, his face aging a decade in the span of a heartbeat. "And she's going to destroy us all." The telephone began ringing again, urgent, insistent, carrying news that would make this moment seem simple by comparison. Frank stared at the letter on Hoover's desk and realized that the game he'd been playing for 3 years had just evolved into something infinitely more dangerous. War between father and son, with Frank caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had been brewing since before he was born. His voice carried 40 years of accumulated authority, but Frank heard the tremor beneath it, the sound of a man whose empire was cracking at the foundation. Frank watched the director's face transform as he listened. Color drained from Hoover's cheeks, leaving behind the waxy pallor of a corpse. His free hand gripped the desk edge with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "Where?" Hoover's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you certain it's him?" Another pause. Frank could hear the tinny crackle of urgent speech from the receiver, words too distant to understand but carrying the unmistakable rhythm of catastrophic news. "Secure the scene. No press, no local police. Bureau personnel only." Hoover's gaze found Frank's face, and for the first time in 3 years, Frank saw fear in those cold eyes. "And bring me everything he had on him. Everything." The line went dead. Hoover replaced the receiver with mechanical precision, but his hand lingered on the black plastic as if drawing strength from its solid reality. "Vincent Torino is dead," he announced. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. The room spun slightly, gravity shifting beneath him. Uncle Vinny, the man who'd raised him after his parents died, who'd taught him how to read people and survive dangerous games, was gone. "How?" Frank's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Single gunshot to the head. Professional work. They found him in his car on a side street in Queens, 3 blocks from the cemetery where his mother is buried. Hoover stood slowly, moving to retrieve another file from his cabinet. The same cemetery where Catherine Moreau was supposedly laid to rest in 1926. Frank's mind struggled to process the implications. But if she's alive, then someone has been maintaining that grave for 40 years. Someone who wanted Vincent to have a place to visit the woman he believed was his mother. Hoover opened the new file, revealing surveillance photographs that looked decades old. Someone who's been watching, waiting, planning. The photographs showed a young woman with dark hair and elegant features, Catherine Moreau, captured by bureau cameras in the summer of 1925. But it was the next photograph that made Frank's blood freeze. A man in his 30s standing beside her outside a Chicago nightclub. The face was younger, unmarked by time and power, but unmistakably familiar. Uncle Vinny, taken sometime in the late 1940s. She made contact with him, Frank breathed. She told him who his father was. More than that. Hoover turned another page, revealing correspondence written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter on his desk. She's been guiding his career for 20 years. Every strategic move, every territory expansion, every calculated risk that built his empire. Vincent Torino didn't rise to power through luck or brutality. He had an advisor who understood exactly how federal investigations worked. The betrayal hit Frank like a landslide. Every family dinner where Uncle Vinny had shared stories about his early years. Every conversation about strategy and survival. Every moment of trust and affection. All of it contaminated by this deeper game, this multi-generational war between abandoned lovers. She used him, Frank said. Used him to get revenge on you. Hoover's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition so painful that Frank almost looked away. No, the director said quietly. I think she loved him, genuinely loved her son. But love and vengeance aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're the same thing. Tolson appeared in the doorway again, his face grave. Director, there's something else. We found a briefcase in Torino's car. It contained... He paused, glancing at Frank uncertainly. Speak freely, Hoover ordered. Agent Torino is about to learn things that will either kill him or make him indispensable. Either way, operational security is no longer relevant. Financial records, going back 30 years. Documentation of payments made to federal employees. Tolson's voice carried the weight of institutional collapse. Names, dates, amounts. Everyone from congressional aides to federal judges. And... The pause stretched like a held breath. Bureau personnel, Tolson finished, including some very senior agents. Frank felt the last pieces of his understanding crumble. The corruption wasn't just in Uncle Vinny's organization. It was threaded through the very institution he'd sworn to serve. How many of his colleagues were compromised? How many investigations had been sabotaged from within? Vincent was documenting everything, Hoover said, his voice carrying grudging admiration. Building his own insurance policy, just like his father. The words hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that made Frank's skin crawl. Hoover had just admitted it. Vincent Torino was his son. The monster Frank had been hunting was family, and the man he'd been serving was the monster's father. Except Vincent made one mistake, Hoover continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He thought he was playing my game, but Catherine taught him well too well. She made him arrogant. Frank stared at his superior officer, the man he'd respected, feared, and served faithfully for 3 years, and finally saw him clearly. Not a patriot or a protector, but a frightened old man whose chickens were finally coming home to roost. What was his mistake? Frank asked. Hoover's smile was colder than winter in Moscow. He thought I didn't know who he was. Frank's world tilted on its axis. The revelation crashed through him like a wave of ice water, leaving him struggling to breathe in the suddenly suffocating air of Hoover's office. You've known, he whispered. All along, you've known. Since 1963, Hoover's voice carried the weight of years spent planning. A photograph surfaced during a routine surveillance operation. Vincent at his mother's grave, the grave I'd paid to have maintained for 38 years. He was placing flowers on Catherine's headstone, and the way he stood, the angle of his jaw. I saw myself at that age. The director moved to another cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder secured with red ribbon. I had his blood type checked against mine through bureau medical records, confirmed the birth date, cross-referenced financial records from hotels where Catherine and I had met. His fingers traced the folder's edge. DNA testing wasn't available then, but I didn't need it. The evidence was overwhelming. Frank felt sick. Every meeting with Uncle Vinny replayed in his mind with sickening clarity. The older man's knowing smiles, his careful questions about bureau procedures, the way he'd always seemed one step ahead of federal investigations. "And you let me believe I was playing both sides," Frank said. "Let me think I was some kind of double agent when really I was just a conduit," Hoover finished. Information flowing both ways through a channel that neither side suspected was compromised. "You were perfect for the role, Agent Torino. Ambitious enough to be corrupted, moral enough to be trusted, and naive enough to never question why your uncle wanted a federal agent in the family." Tolson cleared his throat from the doorway. "Director, we need to discuss immediate containment. If Vincent documented his sources within the Bureau, he did more than document them." Hoover opened the red-ribbon folder, revealing surveillance photographs that made Frank's stomach lurch. Bureau agents meeting with known criminals, envelopes changing hands, a senior investigator sharing drinks with one of Uncle Vinny's lieutenants. He orchestrated their recruitment. Catherine taught him well. She understood that corrupting the investigators was more valuable than avoiding them. Frank recognized faces in the photographs, men he'd worked alongside, supervisors he'd reported to. The corruption wasn't an infection in the Bureau's bloodstream. It was the bloodstream itself. "How many?" Frank asked. 37 confirmed compromised agents, 12 federal judges, 6 congressional staffers, 2 deputy directors. Hoover's voice carried the clinical detachment of a pathologist examining a corpse. "Vincent spent 20 years building a network that could neutralize any investigation before it began." The telephone rang again. This time Tolson answered, his face growing paler as he listened. "It's Chicago," he reported. "The Castellano family is mobilizing. Word on the street is that Vincent's death wasn't random. Someone's making a move on his territory." Hoover nodded slowly. "Catherine's endgame. She didn't just want Vincent to destroy me. She wanted to ensure his empire would survive his death. The question is who inherits his organization." Frank felt the walls closing in around him. Uncle Vinny was dead. The Bureau was compromised beyond repair. And somewhere in the shadows, a woman who'd been orchestrating revenge for 40 years was positioning her final pieces on a board Frank was only beginning to understand. "There's something else," Tolson continued. "The New Jersey house, Vincent's estate. Our surveillance team reports unusual activity. Black cars arriving, men in expensive suits. It looks like a meeting. Or a funeral," Hoover said quietly. "Catherine's revealing herself. After 4 decades in hiding, she's coming forward to claim her son's legacy." Frank stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the darkening federal triangle. Below, government workers streamed out of buildings, heading home to families who believed their husbands and fathers were protecting democracy. None of them knew that the institution they served had been hollowed out from within by a woman's patient vengeance. "What happens now?" Frank asked. Hoover's reflection appeared beside his in the window glass, 2 men staring into an uncertain future. "Now we discover whether 40 years of collecting secrets was enough to survive having our own exposed." The director's words carried a finality that made Frank's skin crawl. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It wasn't about justice or protecting the public. It was about survival, pure and simple. "Agent Torino," Hoover said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm going to ask something of you that violates every oath you've taken, every principle you've sworn to uphold." Frank turned from the window, meeting the director's eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he saw Hoover not as an authority figure, but as what he truly was, a desperate old man whose empire was crumbling around him. "What do you need me to do?" Hoover's smile was terrible to behold. "Help me kill Catherine Moreau, before she finishes destroying everything we've both spent our lives building." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Frank stared at the man who had shaped his career, his understanding of justice, his very sense of right and wrong, and saw a stranger wearing Hoover's face. "You're asking me to commit murder," Frank said quietly. "I'm asking you to save the Bureau, to save your country from the chaos that will follow when 40 years of classified intelligence hits the streets." Hoover's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed him. trembling slightly as he closed the red-ribboned folder. Catherine Moreau has been dead to the world since 1926. Making that death official would simply be correcting a clerical error. Frank felt something fundamental break inside him. The moral compass that had guided him through 3 years of increasingly compromised decisions finally shattered completely. He thought of Uncle Vinny's body cooling in a Queen Street, of the corruption photographs scattered across Hoover's desk, of 40 years of carefully constructed lies crumbling into truth. "No," he said. The single word fell into silence, so complete that Frank could hear the building settling around them. Hoover's face transformed, confusion flickering across features that had forgotten how to show vulnerability. "Agent Torino, you don't understand the stakes." "I understand perfectly." Frank's voice grew stronger as clarity emerged from chaos. "You want me to clean up a mess that started before I was born, to murder a woman whose only crime was loving you and bearing your child, to preserve an institution that's rotten from the foundation up." Tolson stepped forward from the doorway. "Frank, think about your career, your future. The director is offering you a chance to what? Become another of his secrets?" Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How many people have you asked to cross lines for the greater good, director? How many agents have you turned into weapons and then discarded when they became inconvenient?" Hoover's composure cracked completely. "Everything I've done has been in service of this nation's security. Every compromise, every difficult decision, every betrayal," Frank interrupted, "including the son you abandoned and the woman who loved you." The director's face went white. "You think you understand? You think this is some romantic tragedy?" His voice rose to something approaching a shout. "Catherine Moreau has spent 4 decades systematically destroying everything that protects this country from chaos. She's turned my own son against me, corrupted federal institutions, orchestrated the assassination of Vincent Torino." Frank's words cut through Hoover's tirade like a blade. "Your son. She orchestrated the murder of your own son." The revelation hit Hoover like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, catching himself against his desk, scattering the surveillance photographs. For a moment, the mask of authority fell completely away, revealing the broken man beneath, a father who had unknowingly engineered his child's destruction. "No," Hoover whispered. "Vincent was killed by rivals, gang warfare, the usual." "Think," Frank pressed. Who else knew about his trip to the cemetery? Who else could have predicted his movements with enough precision to position an assassin? He gestured toward the letters on the desk. "She's been pulling strings for 40 years. Every move calculated, every outcome planned." Tolson moved to the window, his face ashen. "The endgame isn't revenge against you, director. It's complete destruction. She used Vincent to expose your methods, then eliminated him to create a power vacuum that will tear his organization apart from within. The resulting chaos will force congressional investigations, Senate hearings, complete exposure of bureau operations." Hoover aged a decade in 10 seconds. The terrible truth crystallized in his eyes. Catherine hadn't just outmaneuvered him strategically, she had outmaneuvered him emotionally. Used his own abandonment, his own guilt, as weapons against him. "She loved him," Hoover said, his voice barely audible. "You said she loved him." "The way you love the Bureau," Frank replied. "Enough to sacrifice anything for its ultimate victory, including the thing you love most." The telephone began ringing again, urgent and insistent. None of them moved to answer it. In the growing darkness outside, Washington continued its business, unaware that one of its most powerful institutions was collapsing in real time. Finally, Hoover straightened. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. "What do you recommend, Agent Torino?" Frank looked at this broken old man, his superior, his manipulator, the architect of his own destruction, and felt something unexpected, pity. "We end it," Frank said quietly. "All of it. The corruption, the blackmail, the secrets. We expose everything and let the pieces fall where they may. That will destroy the Bureau. The Bureau is already destroyed. We just decide whether it dies with some dignity intact or whether we let Catherine Moreau finish her work." Hoover nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. After 40 years of building power through shadows and fear, he was finally facing an enemy who had learned his methods too well and improved upon them. The war was over. The only question remaining was how many casualties the surrender would claim. 43 years, Hoover whispered, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated secrets. I've been director for 43 years, built this institution from nothing. Protected presidents, stopped communists, kept this country safe from enemies foreign and domestic. He looked down at his hands, noting their tremor as if seeing it for the first time. And it all ends because I fell in love with a Chicago nightclub singer. Tolson moved quietly to the bar cart in the corner, pouring 3 glasses of whiskey with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this ritual countless times before. He offered one to Hoover, one to Frank, keeping the third for himself. To Vincent, Hoover said, raising his glass, to my son. They drank in silence, the amber liquid burning throats already raw with unshed grief. Frank thought of Uncle Vinny's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he told stories about the old country, how he'd always made sure Frank had enough money for college. A man who'd been playing a game he didn't fully understand, manipulated by both the mother he'd never known and the father who'd abandoned him. The irony is almost perfect, Hoover continued, setting down his empty glass. I spent decades collecting secrets about other men's failures as fathers, as husbands, as human beings, used their weaknesses to control them, and all the while my own son was building an empire on the very corruption I claimed to fight. Frank pulled out his bureau credentials, staring at the badge that had once meant everything to him. What happens to us? To the agents who tried to do their jobs honestly? Some will find work in other agencies. Others will face congressional hearings, possible prosecution. Hoover's voice carried no emotion now, just the flat recitation of facts. The Bureau will be restructured, renamed, rebuilt from the ground up. It will take decades to restore public trust. And you? Hoover smiled, and for a moment Frank glimpsed the younger man who had once believed he could reform American law enforcement through sheer force of will. I'm 72 years old, Agent Torino. I have no family, no life outside these walls. When this institution dies, I'll die with it. The admission hung between them like a prayer. Frank realized he was witnessing the end of an era. Not just the collapse of a corrupt organization, but the final chapter of a man who had defined himself entirely through his work. Without the Bureau, Hoover would simply cease to exist. Tolson returned to the window, his silhouette sharp against the lights of the Federal Triangle. The Chicago office is reporting that Vincent's lieutenants are meeting with federal prosecutors, offering testimony in exchange for immunity. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It appears Catherine provided them with detailed instructions before Vincent's death. She's orchestrated a controlled demolition. Brilliant, Hoover murmured, and Frank heard genuine admiration beneath the devastation. She could have simply exposed everything at once, created chaos and confusion. Instead, she's ensuring maximum damage while minimizing her own exposure. The truth will emerge slowly, methodically, giving her time to disappear again. Frank moved to the desk where the photographs lay scattered. 40 years of surveillance, blackmail, and institutional corruption reduced to paper and chemicals. Will they find her? Catherine Moreau? Hoover shook his head. She's been a ghost for 4 decades. She'll become one again. His voice carried a note of something that might have been pride. I taught her too well how to hide in plain sight. The 3 men stood in contemplative silence as darkness completed its conquest of the sky outside. Frank thought about the moral certainties that had brought him to this moment. His belief in justice, his faith in institutions, his conviction that good men could triumph over evil through dedication and sacrifice. All of it revealed as naive fantasy, the comfortable delusions of a young man who had never seen the machinery of power with its covers removed. I'm going to resign, Frank said quietly. Hoover nodded, probably wise. Though I suspect your resignation letter will be lost in the avalanche of paperwork the coming investigations will generate. Frank gathered his coat from the chair where he'd draped it hours earlier, when he still believed he was hunting a criminal instead of mourning a family member. At the door he paused, looking back at the 2 old men who had shaped his understanding of federal service. Director, he said, for whatever it's worth, I think you did love him, in your way. Hoover's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Not enough," he whispered. "Never enough." Frank left them there in their mausoleum of secrets, two guardians of an empire that no longer existed, and walked out into a Washington night that felt different, somehow older, sadder, but perhaps more honest than the one he had known before.